That was a 1,475% increase in strategic theft over a 3-year period. That's significant. So we're actually up on theft. We're just down on incidents. For the love of Pete, please, everybody, stop posting your prevention methods on LinkedIn. It's like somebody giving Belichick the defensive playbook so that he can pick them apart. Well, how did you assign 4 loads to a company that has 2 power units? But if the load doesn't get recovered because we're not sharing information with each other, it just helps the bad guys.
Welcome to Freight Beat, a podcast from the Transportation Intermediaries Association. I'm Merritt.
And I'm Patrick.
Every week, we talk with the people who shape freight, logistics, and how this country moves. Today, we're focused on cargo theft. As you well know, cargo theft has changed and continues to change shape over the years. So we brought in really one of the industry's foremost experts.
And our guest today is Scott Cornell. Scott has spent more than 30 years investigating cargo theft. He built the cargo theft unit at Travelers. He's now a chief risk officer at SPG Cargo and Logistics, and he chairs TAPA Americas, the group that sets supply chain security standards. He also helped write the cargo theft language in the federal bill, CORCA, that's now sitting in front of the Senate. So, Scott, welcome to Freight Beat.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me, guys. Love doing these with you guys and looking forward to our conversation today.
Same here. So honestly, let's just jump right into it. Everyone wants to talk about this. It's probably the biggest issue facing brokers, carriers, shippers, the logistics industry. Just let's talk about cargo theft. When you look online, Scott, with recent trends, you're kind of told that for the first time since 2021, cargo theft has dropped year over year, at least in the first quarter of this year. Is this real? Is it a blip, do you think? Is it some kind of misrepresentation of the data that's out there? What's your take on this as an expert?
Yeah, it's not really, honestly, it has nothing to do with my take. It's just fact-based, right? So I work very closely with CargoNet, which is where the industry gets most of its data and which I think puts out the most accurate cargo theft data for the industry. And I think it's a misinterpretation of the data. So what do I mean by that? CargoNet tracks all incidents related to cargo theft. That doesn't necessarily mean that every incident results in a theft. It could be an incident around intelligence, suspicious activity, attempted thefts that actually didn't result in a theft, things like that. So incidents are down, but incidents involving cargo theft are up. So I actually checked the most recent number this morning in preparation for this. And I spoke with Steve Lang over at CargoNet, who said that it was actually 41 more confirmed cargo theft incidents Q1 2026 than Q1 2025. So we're actually up on theft. We're just down on incidents. Being down on incidents to me, now if I use my opinion as an expert, is not unusual. People are not going to be as consistent about reporting incidents that don't actually result in a cargo theft as they are an actual cargo theft. So I think when you look at incidents that might involve intelligence or attempts or suspicious activity or just sharing of information, that can be very volatile. But people are going to report the cargo thefts if they're members of CargoNet or if they know to report to CargoNet.
Why do you think they're not reporting some of this stuff? Like, I guess, why do you think the industry are not? But
I think incidents are more volatile, right? If you have a theft, you know you have a theft,
Sure.
right? But if somebody tried to steal something from you and they just didn't make it through your vetting process, and the person that was doing your vetting process didn't pick up on the red flags, or if a company had somebody attempt to do a pilferage, let's say at a truck stop, and nothing was lost, or a very small amount was lost, people will go, do I need to report this? Should I report this? Probably. I'll get to it later. And that stuff is going to be less consistent. But when you have a theft, you want help. So you're going to be more consistent about reporting an actual theft because you need help.
Okay, no, makes sense.
So out of curiosity, I feel like this is something that constantly is changing and trying to stay ahead of the cargo thieves. But what is the tactic that you are seeing most right now or has your attention the most that's kind of, I don't know, maybe it's new, maybe it's a revision of something from the past. What are you seeing right now?
I have a couple of answers for you on that. I think one of the most common incidents that we're continuing to see is the purchased MC. There's a lot of I'm a big stickler for the vernacular in the industry. So there's cargo theft, there's straight theft, and strategic theft. A lot of people just like freight fraud as the lingo and things like that. But fraud is actually a couple of small categories within the strategic theft bucket. One of them is MC number fraud. We're seeing a very strong presence of and continued use of that MC purchase fraud, where they purchase the MC and they fraudulently represent themselves as the company that they bought, making you think that there's been no change in ownership and things like that. And inside that method, we continue to see an increase in email breach in order to conduct that and make that a more believable method of strategic theft. So that's very common right now. Double brokering scams continue to be very common. A blending of the MC number fraud and double brokering scams is becoming very common. That's what we're seeing the most across the industry. What's really got my attention lately is, and I know we're going to talk about this more in depth a little bit later on in this conversation, is the ramming of escort vehicles in 2 incidents recently in California on a couple of escorted high security loads. So that is something I always want to be careful. I think that when you have a good voice in the industry, you have to be careful to make sure that you're not unduly spreading panic and things like that. So I don't think there's any panic around this. I don't think anybody should, get all worked up about it, but it's an escalation from what we have traditionally seen in the United States for cargo theft. We don't usually see that type of a tactic. So that one's got a lot of attention right now.
I know we'll get into the specifics of it more, but what do you think drove that? I mean, I at least listened to a podcast you did recently where you said, luckily, cargo theft is generally a non-violent kind of thing. But recently, I mean, this kind of change makes it different than it has been in the past. Is there an air of desperation to get this happen? Is there a loss of revenue? What's causing them to go to such extremes?
Yeah, it would be, it's pure speculation based on just my opinion and my experience. I think it's the values. What they're targeting when they do that are very high value commodities. So I think that they're looking at the risk versus reward part of it. Cargo theft in the United States is largely nonviolent. We can't say that for other countries, Mexico, South America, various parts of Europe. There's a lot of violence tied to cargo theft. We've always been very lucky here in the United States that we don't have much violence. It's usually somewhere in the 2 to 3% of all cargo theft has some violence associated with it. I mean, you can argue it either way. I don't consider ramming violence. When I think of violence, I think of hijacking, gunpoint robbery, physical altercations with drivers, things like that. And usually when we see those types of things, those violent, or what I would consider violent related cargo thefts, it's last mile courier around pharma. So we don't even usually see it in full truckload or pilferage or any of that kind of stuff. So we're lucky, if I'm a glass half full guy around cargo theft in general, we're lucky that we don't have as much violence to deal with here in the States. But I think in these cases, what you have is it's a risk versus reward mentality with these guys. And they just look at the value of these loads and they think, hey, if we can get away with ramming a vehicle and then running away and getting a high value load, let's take the chance.
I'm curious about kind of what you're seeing lately, over the last year or more, about kind of what is the most targeted commodities that are being targeted, I suppose. But I did want to, just before that, I'm curious, in your experience, are thieves and fraudsters, are they commonly kind of copycat-ish? I asked because you mentioned obviously there's been a slight uptick in these ramming cases. I mean, do other people within that kind of world see that and go, maybe I could try that as well? Is that something you've ever noticed in the past, or they just kind of are, what's the word I'm looking for here? I suppose just kind of, it's an opportunity situation where they just kind of do what they're best at.
I would say that in general terms, cargo theft is a copycat type of a crime, right? When a method becomes effective, we over the years I've said that cargo thieves pressure test methods all the time. they'll try a method, it might fail, it might work, part of the way. They might get 2/3 of the way through a vetting process and then get shut down, and they'll reevaluate and say, okay, this is how they caught us. Let's change that and adjust. And they'll keep pressure testing methods to see if they can get some of these methods to work. So once a method starts to take off, I think a few months back we spoke about the Trojan driver method, right? And that's an example of pressure testing. It's been tried. Now it's effective. Will we see other crews start to do that? So when you take it back to the ramming of the security escorts, that I'd be surprised if all the other crews out there start mimicking that. That's, like I said, that's an escalation.
Mhm.
I think it takes a certain type of organized group to do this and have the mentality to do it. And I don't think all of them have that mentality. I think for the most part, what most experts have always agreed on about cargo thieves is they like the path of least resistance. They like what allows them to stay hidden in the shadows, not get a lot of attention, kind of fly under the radar as much as possible. Not that they're really truly under the radar, but where they're just not out there in a bold sort of way on a daily basis is their preferred method. So I don't think we'll see a lot of copycat of this, but it's really hard to predict something like that.
Gotcha. And then, sorry, just to circle back to my original question, what are you seeing as far as trends, things being targeted, right? Because we see reports coming through our FBI hotline, from everything running from, copper to beef to whatever, a bunch of Haribo gummy bears, I think, came across a little while back. So what are you seeing as far as like major trends?
Yeah, when you look at the big buckets, when you look at the large buckets, like, if you look at the CargoNet numbers, they have the big buckets. Food and beverage continues to be number one. And I always say when all things are normal, using air quotes, in cargo theft, that'll be your number one targeted commodity because it's so easy for them to move. The evidence is consumed, it disappears, it's hard to trace. You have a very short window for recovery if you're investigating it. So most people only pursue it so far, so long. So they love that commodity, and that's always the number one bucket. Household goods is number two. But when you start to really get down into singular commodities, one particular commodity, then you get into metals, which has been just absolutely, the metal industry has been absolutely hammered over the past 2 years now. You get into, when you dial down into that food and beverage commodity bucket, you get into that frozen meat and seafood, energy drinks, just absolutely getting hammered and targeted. Alcohol, cosmetics have seen an uptick, especially in the Northeast and the upper Midwest. But one of the things that I think is very alarming, and it kind of ties into what we've already talked about and what we're going to talk about, are these targeting of these really high tech loads, things that are going in these data centers or just really high tech technology. While there's not a massive frequency there's enough of a frequency that really makes you raise your eyebrows. I mean, you look at the values: Bitcoin mining machines, 2.7 million, server equipment, 1.2 million, memory module server equipment, 31 million, memory module server equipment, 10 million, graphics card, 1.5 million, network and server adapters, 14 million, hard drives and memory, 7.9 million. When you start to see these types of values being targeted, it really raises an eyebrow. There recently, fiber optic cable, 24 million, more server racks, 10 million, server components, 13 million. Those are big numbers. And while there's certainly not as many of those as there is in food and beverage or metals or frozen meats and seafoods and all that, I mean, look at the numbers you're talking about. Those are astronomical numbers.
You brought up in our conversation beforehand something that I thought was interesting, was just the role that brokers play in all this. A lot of avoidable mistakes, and how 50% of these kind of these things are self-inflicted wounds, essentially. And the concept of double brokering. So what role do brokers really play in this? And I mean, what are you seeing out there that's like obvious things that people should be more cognizant of and taking more seriously?
It's a great question. It's a great topic. So let's tie in a couple of the things that we've talked about already. When you look at some of these high value loads, these high tech, high value loads, some of them were double brokered, triple brokered, quadruple brokered, things like that. How is that happening? When we talk about, some self-inflicted pain that still exists in the industry, how is that happening with loads of that value? Um, when you look at all the different platforms that are out there in the industry that can help you vet carriers, and you look at, TAPA as an example with the freight broker security requirement standards and things like that, how is some of this stuff happening? Gary Thomas, who works here with us, it seems very simple, but he always says, you can have all these platforms you want, but you need to just Google things. You just need to start Googling things. When some of these high tech loads that were stolen, one of them in particular, you Google the trucking company and you find out that it's a auto hauler that just does hotshot auto. They don't even have trailers, right? So you look at them, they have a company name, they have an MC number, they're a valid company. You look in the platforms and they pass vetting because everything is there that would be needed to pass vetting. But if you Google it, you see pictures of the company operating, and it's, a dually pickup truck hauling a hotshot auto hauler. And you would not assign a load like that to a company like that. And if you would just Google them, you would see. We still see things like, hey, we assigned 4 loads to this company and they disappeared. And when I went into the FMCSA and checked their record, they only have 2 power units. Well, how did you assign 4 loads to a company that has 2 power units? And I think that there's also a bit too much dependency on some of the tech that's out there, right? All too often, I'll work with one of our clients, and we work closely with our clients on teaching them how not to have the cargo thefts in the first place. And one of the things we do is we vet their process. We talk to them about, hey, walk us through your process. And a little too often we see clients that will say, or just in general in the industry, I'll see people who say, well, we reduced the team that vets the carriers because we purchased such and such a platform. And my comment there is, you're just way too heavy on the tech side. You're just depending on the tech to be accurate every time. And that human touch is really still needed in the vetting process. You have to have that human instinct that just tells you something's wrong here, or that I have to take an extra step, or I have to check another thing. And I think all too often it's small mistakes like that. Now, post Montgomery, with a lot of companies having to vet carriers more vigorously in general, not just for cargo theft, but for safety, I think some of that stuff will actually get cleaned up, right? Because I think you'll have dual information coming. You'll have information coming from, the platform that you're relying on to vet for theft, and information coming from the platform that you're relying on to vet for safety. And, comparatively, you'll see a bit more information that will maybe push you away from some of that self-inflicted stuff sometimes. So I'm hopeful. I'm trying to be glass half full with that.
Today's episode of Freightbeat is brought to you in part by TIA Bond. TIA Bond, powered by Avalon Risk Management, is the flagship bond program backed by TIA's values as a leader and advocate for 3PL companies. With the backing of Avalon, it's the best choice for brokers looking for assurance. From higher bond limits than competing products to a dedicated staff of underwriters and claim experts, as well as the TIA Bond certificate that shows you're committed to professionalism above and beyond the standard, it's the best choice in the market. If you're interested in learning more, head to tianet.org/bond. Thanks again to Avalon for powering this incredible program.
So obviously, you talked a little bit about there kind of being a new shape of what cargo theft looks like, right? You've mentioned strategic theft, you mentioned straight theft. So you mentioned obviously there's these crews out there that are much more organized than perhaps the perception was in the past, right? We used to think it was just a guy cutting a lock off a trailer at a truck stop somewhere, something like that. But it's much more evolved than that. Can you speak a bit to what that new normal is? And then also, when you make that distinction between straight strategic theft, what are we talking about here, right? Like, what is that distinction? What are we paying attention to? And how does that all kind of come together?
Yeah, we'll start with the definitions first. Straight theft is called straight theft because it's straightforward. They physically go out and they steal the freight, right? They're physically going out, taking the tractor and the trailer or the unmarried trailer, or they're pilfering, right? They're opening the rear doors and taking a couple of pallets, things like that. So straight theft is very, very simple. And I think one of the things that we're seeing the industry lose track of a little bit is straight theft is still the number one method of cargo theft in the United States. It's still roughly 67 to 68%, almost 70% of all cargo theft in the United States. But strategic theft, which the definition of strategic theft is, if we want to boil it down to its easiest definition, is it begins with deception. Begins with some form of deception, some form of trickery. And then it proceeds into tricking somebody into giving them the freight unknowingly, but almost willingly, right? But strategic theft has grown so quickly and so substantially. So it went from roughly 3% or 4% of all cargo theft to about 30 to 33% of all cargo theft in a matter of just a couple of years. And I think another important detail to that is it targeted the part of the supply chain, freight brokers, intermediaries, that were probably the least prepared to be targeted for cargo theft because traditionally they hadn't seen much cargo theft targeting them. It was either targeting the shippers or the warehouses or the trucking companies. And freight brokers were basically witnessing it with the trucking companies they hired or the shippers they were working for, but they weren't being targeted. So you have something go from 2 or 3% to 30 or 33% overnight and targeting a part of the supply chain that wasn't necessarily prepared for it. And it gets so much attention because of the methodology, the sophistication, the tidal wave of it to the industry that it almost makes people forget about the straight theft and how much of it there really is. So the other biggest change that we see in cargo theft is it went from these small regional crews, like you said, a group of maybe 6, 8, 10 guys that were always working together or knew each other that were doing, again, 97% of all cargo theft was straight theft, and they were working out of Southern California or Florida or Memphis or Chicago, New Jersey, just doing the straight theft stuff, to these massive international crime rings operating out of 24 different countries, puppeteering strategic theft here in the United States. That's a huge change for the industry. It's also very difficult for law enforcement to combat because the head of the snake is not here. Law enforcement across the country has done an absolutely fantastic job. California, the New York City, NYPD, and federal agencies with the big arrests that we've seen in New York and New Jersey recently. California, the CTIPS team and LA County Sheriff's team and everything, getting these big arrests in California. But the people that they're arresting, I equate them to being regional managers. You're not getting the president of the company, so to speak, right? The president of the company is overseas. So they just replace these guys very quickly and they continue on.
I do think that's very interesting, by the way. You're pointing out that the straight theft is still happening, right? Even though the street theft is much more, for lack of a better word, sexy, right? People are drawn to it because it's fascinating. It's very Ocean's 11 as opposed to, I don't know, the opening scene of the Fast and the Furious, something like that, So, but that's very interesting how that new normal is still the old normal. It's just there's this new guy in town as well. Interesting.
Yeah, but I mean, going from 2 or 3% to 33% is a big.
It is massive.
That's a big new normal, right? That was a 1,475% increase in strategic theft over a 3-year period. That's significant.
I listened to a podcast recently where you kind of compared what some of these guys do, where they bring back tactics of the past to kind of what Coach Belichick does, where and as a Panthers fan, I think anybody who is not a Patriots fan has felt some serious pain with Belichick. So of course that's stuck in my mind. But when they recycle an old technique like he does with, old defensive plays, he'll kind of go back to that well when the current stuff is run dry or when people seem to have kind of figured that out. How can you put systems into place where you're combating the things that you've seen before so that when they inevitably come up again in some shape, form, or fashion, you're ready, while also combating this new stuff that's coming? Like, how can you put good systems into place? Because like you said, the technique might change, but the playbook is kind of still the same.
It's a great question, and I love that topic when we talked about that. Um, I think that, when I work with my clients and we teach our clients, we tell them if you're not re-evaluating your prevention plan every 6 months at the very least, then you're not going to stay on top of things, because that's how quickly we see things change, or we see them adapt to some of the things that the industry puts in place. I think you've probably heard me say this before. I say it all the time. For the love of Pete, please, everybody, stop posting your prevention methods on LinkedIn. Right? It, it it it's like somebody giving Belichick the defensive playbook so that he can pick them apart, right, in the game coming up on the weekend. And the industry, I get it. There's a spirit of wanting to share and wanting to help people do that at better venues, conferences, intelligence meetings, things like that, um, through organizations like TAPA or the regional security councils, the TIA Fraud Task Force, the TIA conference. These are great venues to share these types of things. And even though I do think that sometimes they spy on us at things like that too, I think there's less opportunity for them to get that. But we need to stop sharing that all over the place. I think you need to constantly reevaluate your system. And I think what you never do is you never take something out of your system because you haven't seen that method in a year or two, right? And assuming, well, they just don't do that anymore. If I use ghost trucks as a method, as an example, that's something that I think we're seeing some indications that may come back. Or if I use the Trojan driver method as an example, we know that it's an old school method for cargo thieves to plant members of their crew as employees in warehouses. They've done that for years, distribution centers and warehouses. We know that over the last couple of years, they've started to try and do that with freight brokers. If they can get them employed at a freight broker or at a call center for a freight broker, things like that. So why would we be surprised that they're doing it with drivers? Right. And so as you're developing your process and your procedures and your prevention methods, certainly be as adaptive as you can so that you can be prepared for the new methods. But don't assume that because you haven't seen one of those old methods in a while that you can take something off your plate. I just don't think you can do it, and I don't think you can afford to do it.
So obviously, a lot of this cargo theft runs through the systems. You mentioned systems as far as processes, but literally the technology and the tools that these brokers are using every day, right? Load boards, email, TMS, things like that. Uh, Aside from the human side, right, where you are duped into hiring a bad actor, what are the gaps you have seen? What are these soft spots, and how are the thieves really slipping in?
The soft spots continue to be people, right? And I don't mean that in a critical way, but they know that we're human and that there's going to be room for error because we're human. And so one of the things that we preach the most with our clients, or that I preach the most with TAPA members, or just in general when I talk to somebody like you, is your process and procedures are, first of all, the cheapest, most inexpensive part of your whole plan. And the biggest part of the process and procedures is education. All too often, a company concentrates the knowledge on cargo theft in a small group of people, the head of security or the head of risk, or you name it, right? That there's like two or three people, or maybe one person, and all the knowledge is concentrated in that one person. But that person is not the person dealing with the trucking companies, assigning freight, talking to the shippers, right? You have to educate those people. You have to educate the people on the front line that are handling the deals, moving the freight, assigning the freight, vetting the carriers, working at the warehouse dock, working at the warehouse door, um, your truck drivers. I always say, I've been around this industry for 33 years, and I drove truck early on to help pay my way through college and everything like that. Truck drivers don't make good victims. They do not want their freight stolen, right? They take it very personal that they're hauling somebody's freight. And if you educate the drivers on, here's the danger zones, here's the hot spots, in particular, what you're hauling is targeted here, here, and here along your route, you're going to have a driver that's going to pay a lot more attention. And the same thing goes for strategic theft. When you talk about, you know, the bad guys trying to slip through. Okay, the people assigning the freight need to understand the red flags. They need to ask the right questions. They need to poke a little bit more when they see some of those red flags, or they just need to have enough knowledge to have a bit of a spider sense and raise their hand and get that person that has a lot more knowledge involved. When you talk about the systems, we don't see what I would call traditional or true hacking, where you see in the movies where they're in the system and they're finding some back door to hack into the system and everything, as much as we see social engineering and phishing emails. And they'll just bombard a company with those emails. They'll use AI and they'll just bombard a company with those emails because they know that we're human and that if they send 10 emails a day to every employee you have that's assigning freight, what are the chances that one person one time is going to click on a link they shouldn't click on? Right? So they're just playing the odds, they're playing the numbers. And then once they do that, they'll clone a load board. So now that person thinks that they've signed into a load board that they use every day. It looks the same. They enter their password in. Now they have the password. We see the bad guys creating an email address at the trucking company and going out and actually soliciting loads from freight brokers with a legitimate verifiable email for a trucking company and then deleting all the communications once they're assigned the load. So that's the most common that we see, is that social engineering, phishing emails, and just the human error part of it.
Hey, this episode of Freight Beat is brought to you in part by the TIA Institute for Research and Education. The TIA IRE was founded to help brokers and brokerage employees expand their knowledge base and be ready for anything in this fast paced industry. Members are given unlimited access to a comprehensive set of on demand complimentary courses that cover every aspect of the business. Whether you're interested in how to better leverage intermodal opportunities, you're curious about how you can use artificial intelligence in your everyday work at a brokerage, or you want to dig into the latest in cargo theft and fraud and how you can fight back, TIA IRE is here to keep you on the front foot of brokerage education. Head to tianet.org/education to learn more.
You know, I know you talked about having clients and kind of working through different companies through this stuff, but one thing that you talked about that was interesting, and it's honestly kind of meta when you think about it, is that there are a few experts that really know what they're talking about, how to help you, how to help your company. You're one of them. But you're talking about how inevitably more people are coming out that aren't experts. It's very easy these days to call yourself an expert of anything. But there's a lot of people coming out that are trying to offer their services. How do you be wary of those people who are kind of peddling information or intelligence that actually ends up being either not helpful or harmful at worst?
It's a great question and a great topic. I think that I want to be careful that I answer this in the right way. And I don't mean by soft touching it, but by being accurate in what I say. I think there are a group of people who sincerely want to help, right? And so, they get some experience, um, in different ways. Sometimes, some of the people that I meet, they've experienced cargo theft. And because they've experienced cargo theft, they start digging into the topic and, they gain a certain level of knowledge. There's that old joke, right? I have just enough knowledge to be dangerous. Right. And so they get that kind of level of knowledge and they'll start talking about things. And what happens with that is if you don't really know the topic and you start using the wrong vernacular and you look at a theft and you call it a fictitious pickup when it's really a double brokering scam or something else, you can lead people down the wrong path on how they should prevent it or how they should investigate it or how they should react to it. So I think people have to be careful with that. I understand that a lot of people want to help, and welcome to the table. We'll take all the help we can get, right? Everybody who wants to help, come on board. But just be real and be humble about what you know or what you don't know, right? If you came to me and said, "Hey, Scott, I need some real cyber expertise on cargo theft," I would tell you my knowledge on cyber ends at that social engineering and email uh, type of breach, right? But I know who to get you on the phone with who can talk to you about that. And I have no pride in saying, I'm not the guy. Here's the guy, right? Or here's the person you need to talk to. And I think we all need to be realistic about that. I think at the same time, on the same topic, you have people who see an opportunity in the industry, um, business opportunity around cargo theft and cargo theft prevention. And I think anybody you're going to work with or you're going to deal with on cargo theft, if they say, "Hey, I've done investigations," or anything like that, interview them like you would an employee. Well, tell me what you mean by investigations. Have you done a Keith Lewis type of investigation where Keith Lewis, one of the top experts in the country, has been out there in truck stops in the middle of the night investigating cases, when he was law enforcement, you know making busts, making arrests. Someone like me who spent nights upon nights in my career at truck stops and out there working on recoveries and trying to find recoveries. Or is it somebody who's just poked around on the internet a few times or looked in platforms and things like that? What do you mean by, I've conducted investigations? Or what is your background? How long have you been doing this? There are a lot of key experts in this area, and there are several up and coming experts. And I think you just need to interview anybody you're going to work with and make sure that they have the history, the knowledge. Reach out to people who know, right? Reach out to people who know people, people like Chuck Forsyth, Keith Lewis, Gary Thomas, Curtis Salisbury, Gerardo Pachuca, any of the law enforcement members of CTIPs who work with private investigators or people in the private sector. Call TAPA, call me, reach out, see if there's reference, see if they're known, see if they, if they have a history in the field where people would say, oh yeah, that person really knows her stuff or his stuff. And you'd, really be doing yourself a solid by working with them. But I think you have to be careful because I think there are some people who maybe think they're experts or sometimes just see an opportunity to do business.
Is there, obviously, you are an expert in this. Is there anything you've seen out there that where like you see someone out there purporting themselves to be said type of expert where you're just like, that's the best to smell? It's like immediately something you spot where you go like, that guy is talking some bunk right now.
Yeah. We see it sometimes. I'm not going to name any names. I'm not that, that's not me. That's not my personality, but we definitely see people talking about it. And, one of the key indicators is you see people talking and they're just using all the wrong language, or they're saying, all too often we see people saying, well, this is what's going on out there. And then, sometimes I question myself, right? I go, wait a minute, how do I not know about that? And then I think, I don't think that's what's going on. And I'll call Keith, or I'll call Chuck, or I'll call Gary, or I'll call Ralph Pepe, or I'll call, and I go, are you guys seeing this? And their response is the same as mine. No, and then we realize they're labeling it wrong or they're describing it wrong. And, I don't know what the motivation is there, but yeah, we see it. And that's why I think you just have to be careful where you're getting your information from.
Okay. And then obviously there's a growing argument now that the risk and the damage of cargo theft is actually being overstated. You've been involved in the drafting the language around CORCA, the bill in front of Congress right now. What is your answer to the people who say the numbers are in fact inflated?
Yeah, this is a personal this is a bit aggravating for me, to be honest with you, if I'm being completely forthright. It's so CORCA has made it through Congress and it's in the Senate. And it's largely been bipartisan support of it's really, I went to DC on it multiple times with different people, Dale Prax, Danielle Spinelli, Alex Pandalov, Chuck Forsyth, various people. And every time we went, we got great support from both sides of the aisle. So it was one of those things where, those are moments when you really feel good about what your representatives are doing. You don't see much pushback either side. Everybody on both sides is saying, yeah, this makes sense. And then all of a sudden it makes it through Congress and you're seeing some pushback on it. And a couple of articles come out and they basically say cargo theft is being overhyped. The numbers don't reflect it. And, it's just not really a problem. And when you look at those articles, what's clear is nobody did their homework, right? Nobody actually dug in and found out that, hey, the numbers that are available through CargoNet, first of all, ask yourself, why are the only numbers for cargo theft that are really available coming from an independent company that tracks cargo theft that's voluntarily reported to them? Well, the only reason that would happen is because the federal government is not tracking cargo theft, right? And so if the federal government is not tracking cargo theft, who can tell me what the real numbers are? But why is every TAPA summit, every TI, every TAPA summit, we're at standing room only. Every cargo theft summit in the nation right now, you're at standing room only. When you go to the TIA conference, how many tracks we went from? I've been involved in the TIA. I think it's a great organization for years. And there was usually maybe one or two tracks at the annual conference on cargo theft. Now you go, there's a half a dozen tracks on cargo theft. When I speak on this topic at an event, one of the first things I do is I say, how many people here today, raise your hand, have been affected by cargo theft? 7 years ago, maybe 10 people in the room. If I had 400 people in the room, maybe 10 people in the room would raise their hand. Now, 2/3, 80% of the room raises their hand, right? The ATA, the TCA, the IANA, MICA, TIA, all these different organizations are addressing this with Congress and with the federal government because their members are screaming about it and pounding on the table saying, hey, this is a real issue. So these articles came out saying the numbers aren't there. They don't understand that the CargoNet numbers are just a sample size. I always say the CargoNet numbers reflect about 1/10 of all full truckload cargo thefts and 1/15 of all truckload cargo theft when you include pilferage. And so if you take, the numbers and multiply them by 15, you're probably in the neighborhood. So I just don't think that people did their homework on that. And that's one of the reasons that one of the main parts of the CORCA bill is that the federal government will start tracking cargo theft. Right now, if a police officer in Iowa gets a cargo theft and they're not familiar with cargo theft, they could report it as an auto theft because there's an auto involved technically, right? And a police officer in Missouri could report it as some kind of a property crime, you name it, the category. So how do you pull CargoNet or how do you pull cargo theft numbers out of there? It goes into the bucket of auto theft or it goes into the bucket of property crime. So these articles came out, they're just not researched. They didn't do their homework. And, stuff like that can put an important bill or industry effort at jeopardy.
Well, I just and we're getting close to our time with you, Sky. I mean, I feel like we could talk about this for 5 hours, but I am curious when it comes to CORCA, can you give folks just kind of an outline of why it was created, what it aims to do, and where it's at this point? And I think one thing people feel is like, okay, that if the 50% of issues are self-inflicted, then that means 50% are not. So if I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that we are, doing everything we can to keep anything from happening to us, there's still that 50% chance. So how does CORCA address that other 50%, and how can our members and otherwise help with that cause?
Well, so a couple things I would say is, even when you talk about, and we don't know the true numbers on how much is self-inflicted and how much is not, but even if you look at the self-inflicted ones, it's hard to even call them self-inflicted because there's still a bad guy involved. There's still a bad guy preying on you. There's still a bad guy coming after you, right? So, if you made those mistakes and you assigned a load to, a hotshot auto hauler and they were not a bad guy, that hotshot auto hauler would say, we just don't haul this stuff. So you got to go find somebody else, right? So in all cases, whether there's some mistakes made or not, you have bad guys present trying to take advantage of somebody and trying to steal from somebody. And so I think one of the most important things the CORCA bill does is it creates mandatory tracking of cargo theft in the United States under its own uniform criminal reporting category. It creates a federal task force and federal funding for task forces. So you would have that would be led by HSI. And then I think the FBI and several other federal agencies would be involved in those task force efforts. And, if you talk to state law enforcement, they'll tell you that some of the most difficult things that they deal with is that the thefts they're dealing with cross state lines all the time. And so how do you get, who's got the jurisdiction and how do you get cooperation in other states? Well, that federal task force being across all states would allow for smooth transition of all those issues across the country. And then it designates federal prosecutors to prosecute these crimes. And if you know anything about federal prosecutors, when they dial in on a specific type of crime, they get really good at it and they know how to go after people and they will put people in jail. We need all of that. And that's why this bill is so important.
So, kind of, let's look at a couple years, right? Let's kind of game plan this a little bit. With all these groups getting more organized, more technical, more sophisticated, Where is this heading in your view, and kind of what has to change for the industry to get ahead of it? And even beyond that, like how can brokers, people working the supply chain anywhere, take advantage of groups like the TIA to get ahead of these things?
I think if you're a member of the TIA, it's honestly, I speak at a lot of different conferences and a lot of different industry events. But I think, and I'm not saying it because I'm on your podcast, I've been involved with you guys for so many years. One of the reasons I'm involved is because the TIA is so aggressive on this topic for their members. So if you're a TIA member, you have the watchdog. Now you have Wendy taking in theft reports that she then gets that intel directly to the FBI on behalf of the members. Um, you know, as the chairman of TAPA, we're working with the TIA to try and see if we can find some kind of partnership on bringing the freight broker security requirement standard to the TIA. And just the fact that the TIA is having that conversation with us shows you that they look at every possible solution for the members. We have the TIA of Cargo Theft Task Force, led by Dan and then co-chaired by me, and we have several good members on there. And we're always trying to create services and different resources for the TIA membership. So take advantage of all that. Look into that. Make sure you're visiting the website or reaching out to your TIA contact and educating yourself on what's available. Join organizations like TAPA. TAPA is a nonprofit organization. The membership is relatively cheap, but there's no commercial angle to it. They create great standards for the industry. We're very proud of that. We educate. We hold the two largest cargo theft summits in the nation, the National Summit in May and the Solution Summit in November. That's going to be in Phoenix this year. Participate. That's a huge thing. Participate. Continue to educate yourself. Get involved. The Southwest Transportation Security Council, which covers Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Arizona, New Mexico. Great organization, longest standing security council in the country, 27 years, led by JJ Colgan, one of the key experts in the country. $200 for your company to join that. $200. You can have 10 people from your company attend the conference for that every year, which is also one of the largest ones, for $200, right? The Midwest Cargo Security Council, based out of Chicago. I think that's around the same. Don't quote me on that, but I think it's around the same $250 for your company to be a member of that. The Northeast Security Council has recently been stood back up by Sal Marino. Also cheap dues to get involved in that. So get involved, participate in these councils, keep yourself educated, get involved in the TIA intel sharing. Make sure that you know the most up-to-date intel that you can know every day.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. I think I just want to ask one last question, if you don't mind. And it's just, or maybe it's more of an observation, but I think there's this air of kind of, we're all in this together. There's this collaborative approach that I think needs to be embraced more often. When you get stolen from, it feels like you said, even for a truck driver, it's like, that's mine. Like, you don't take that from me. That's my reputation on the line. So when people get stolen from, they're of course reticent to share that kind of information. But this spirit of collaboration, I think, is really going to make a huge difference coming down the line, where you're sharing what you're seeing. When something bad happens, there's this air of more of transparency. Do you feel like that the industry is kind of moving in that direction, where it's like, you know what, we've all experienced this, so the shame can go away and we can really try to work together now?
I definitely do. I go back to the comment I made earlier about, it used to be 10 people in the audience would raise their hand, and now it's 80%. When we got past that, I think 30 or 40% mark, everybody started saying, okay, this is a problem for everybody. We need to start talking more openly about it. If I look at the participation on the TIA Cargo Theft Task Force, you have all different companies on there, who on a daily basis are competing with each other in the industry, but they get on there to tackle the same problem together because they know, hey, we're all dealing with this same problem. When you come to the TAPA National Summit, you have 400 plus people in the room, 65 of which this year were law enforcement collaborating with the private industry on what's going on. And you have, the other 335 people in the room there that are, again, probably competing with each other on a daily basis, but they're to tackle the same problem and talk openly about it. So there's definitely been I think a complete move in the industry to just, hey, we just all need to talk about this. We can't act like it doesn't happen to us. Everybody knows this happens. How do we help each other? And the last thing I would say on that is when you have a theft, and sometimes, especially in this intermediary space, that theft will involve multiple parties. When you have that, there's a normal reaction to say, well, hey, we have to be very guarded about what we say because we don't want the blame, or or we're not sure who's at fault. The cargo thieves know that. They hope that happens every time they steal something. We have to cooperate with each other when these thefts happen. If the load gets recovered, all the issues go away. 9 times out of 10, all the issues will go away if the load gets recovered, right? And everybody feels good about working together when the load gets recovered. But if the load doesn't get recovered because we're not sharing information with each other, it just helps the bad guys.
Well, it's been fascinating stuff. Obviously, it's ever evolving. We're going to have to probably check back in with you every couple, let's say, weeks to see what kind of changes. Scott Cornell, you are the Chief Risk Officer at SPG Cargo Logistics and Chair of TAPA Americas. If you want to go deeper on the security standards we talked about, TAPA's work is at TAPA Online. That's TAPA online.org. Scott, where should people go to follow what you're putting out, and how can they reach you?
Yeah, I'm easy to find on LinkedIn, and that's usually the easiest way to see what I'm putting out. And I put out both our company related stuff and TAPA related stuff, and even I repost a lot of TIA related stuff and everything like that because I participate with you guys so much. So I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. Go on there, and people reach out to me all the time that they've had thefts, things like that. I'm always happy to help people. I always tell people, you don't have to be my client. I will help you as much as I can. I will get you in contact with the right people. I will answer questions, things like that. So I'm happy to help.
Fantastic stuff. Well, hey, again, Scott, appreciate you having you here. And thank you, everyone, for listening to another great episode of here of Freight Beat. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe on whatever podcatching app or YouTube you're using. Can't wait to see you guys again next time. I've been Merritt.
And I, for this week, have been Patrick as well.
There you go. You guys have a great one, and we'll see you next time.